Good afternoon and welcome to the Bulkley Valley Research Center seminar series. My name is Dawn Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of the Bulkley Valley Research Center. Big welcome to David, who's presenting today on a policy perspective on protecting farmland. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this seminar today from the traditional territory of the Gidimt'en Nation of the Wet'suwet'en clan, and I'm on the banks of the Bulkley River in Telkwa. We have a couple of funders who help support this seminar series that we present from September to June every year. I'd like to thank the Bulkley Valley Credit Union and the Bulkley Valley Community Foundation for their support, as well as those of you who are members of the center. Your support does mean a lot and enables us to continue to bring you, our members, services such as the seminar series. And with that, I will introduce David and I will pass it over to him. Dr. David Connell is an associate professor in ecosystem science and management at the University of British Columbia. David is leading a national research program to assess the state of agricultural land use planning for farmland protection in Canada. Central to this work is a method for evaluating the strength of legislative frameworks. He's published in the areas of plan evaluation, planning theory, and farmland protection. And you can learn more at a website, aglup.org. And with that, I will pass it over to you, David.
Oh, thank you, Dawn. And it's a pleasure to be participating in the Bulkley Valley Research Center's seminar series. So thank you for the invitation. I am presenting from the city of Prince George, which is within the traditional territory of the Lheidli So as my title, there are different ways of looking at farmland. And I know there's some certainly biologists in the room, for example, but I am definitely looking at it from a policy perspective. And I've been looking at it, at protecting farmland as through policy for about 10 years now. And it really is driven by what I think is a simple question. And it's how good is the policy that we have to protect farmland? And the question arose really as part of a national project where I'm working with researchers across Canada, looking at local governments across Canada, and just wanted a way to compare them and just have a conversation about which one is better, and also be able to answer the question why one was better than another. So there, again, what I saw is a pretty straightforward question about what is a good policy to protect farmland. Drove my research. But that question certainly can be rather nuanced, as I'll certainly illustrate through the work that I've done. And so the presentation today is a summary and gives you a perspective of protecting farmland through policy perspective, but through the work that I have done. And it stands in contrast to what is the dominant way of looking at farmland. And studies of the loss of farmland have started in the late 50s, specifically in southern Ontario, the Niagara Fruit Belt area. So the 50s, 60s, and 70s, really a lot of really important research was done to document the loss of farmland. And many studies have been done since then. But the point there is that looking at its quantified aspect and trying to quantify the amount of farmland that has been lost. There have been some studies that look at reasons why it's being lost. And there's one study in particular that has been done in the Lower Mainland in the last few years and can get quite detailed in terms of looking at the value of farmland. Certainly the main cause would be expansion of urban areas, but on a parcel by parcel basis can look at proximity to a highway, proximity to residential areas, the contiguous aspect of the land base. And again, the Lower Mainland project actually also looked at who was in power, which political party was in power, to assess political influence. But what strikes me through all that work that looks at the loss of farmland hasn't considered the quality of the policy. So the policy is basically taken as a given, but even comparing the loss of farmland from one jurisdiction to another, generally no systematic means to be able to compare the quality of that policy in one to the other. So while one might do a study on the loss of farmland and conclude that policy needs to be stronger, really the methods used don't answer that primary question in terms of, well, what's the starting point? How good is the policy to start with? So as I said, that's been a question and an approach that I've been exploring for about 10 years. And through that, I actually have developed a method of evaluating the strength and quality of farmland policy, protection policy. So while my interest is on agricultural land, I guess I would encourage you as I'm going through my presentation today is to perhaps think about it from other perspectives. Some of you I can see from the list have specific interests in agriculture, but others might be in forestry and other just other areas of policy. So think about whether or not, or to the extent to which the approach that I've developed specifically for protecting farmland might apply to other areas as well. The next point I guess I want to make, just to help distinguish the work that I'm doing from the dominant work in the area of farmland protection, is that most of those studies that are measuring the loss of farmland are focusing on effectiveness in terms of what is the effect or outcome of a policy intervention. Whereas I'm looking not at the outcome in terms of the change in the land base, but I'm looking at the policy itself, looking at the policy as it is written. And to distinguish the studies of effectiveness, I've used the term efficacy in terms of the power of a policy to achieve its desired outcome. So with that introduction, I'm actually going to jump to some conclusions. So just hit the right button. There we go. So with the introduction, I'll give you start with some conclusions. Jump right to my conclusions to give you a sense of the work that I do, and then I'll kind of backtrack and answer some questions that arise from these conclusions. So one of the big kind of headline type conclusions I reach is that only 7.6% of Canada's best farmland is protected by good provincial legislation. Within BC, or BC as a whole, is certainly recognized as having one of the strongest provincial legislative frameworks in Canada. And another one is that within British Columbia, that the quality of legislative protection of farmland is rather inconsistent. So these are typical conclusions that reflect the type of work that I'm doing. But from those conclusions, it does raise some questions, and questions about how much agricultural land does Canada have? So from a policy perspective, how is this measured? What do we mean by best farmland? And the question that really, the first two questions are almost background work for me to then to ask the question about how do we know if legislation is good? So starting with that first question in terms of measuring the amount of farmland we have in Canada, I actually forget the actual numbers, but this picture shows where it's located. And the big kind of conclusion is that although Canada is large and the general perception is that we have an abundance of farmland, only 7% of the land base is actually used for agriculture. But this map shows certainly in BC that agricultural land is primarily in the valleys, valley bottoms. And then across the rest of Canada, it's almost where the Canadian Shield is not, is where you tend to find agricultural land. But it's not just where the land is located and how it's distributed across Canada, but also looking at the quality of the farmland. So the Canada Land Inventory, again, this is, from a policy perspective, this is the important means of measuring quality of farmland. And BC has its own version of this, so the BCLI, but both are attempting to measure agricultural land capability, which has 7 classes. I guess it also applies to forestry and recreation and wildlife, when it was started at least. But both, the CLI has 7 classes plus some subclasses, and it ranges from 1 to 7, 1 being no intervention, and then increasingly greater requirements for human intervention in order to increase the productivity or capability of the soil. And just to answer one of the questions I posed then was, how do we know what's best agricultural land? From a policy perspective, it is the world of agricultural land use planning is driven by or has primary concern for protecting the best agricultural land, and then whenever possible, mitigating impacts by directing non-farm development to lesser quality agricultural land whenever possible. So this is where CLI, from a policy perspective, plays a role. But the primary then interest in terms of protecting the best agricultural land, the term used is prime agricultural land, also referred to as dependable. But those are CLI classes 1 to 3. And then if one includes class 4, then it becomes or referred to as productive agricultural land. So when I say protecting the best agricultural land, it's really talking about prime agricultural land. And so in addition to that map that I just showed about where agricultural land is located across Canada, there's certainly a strong association with where the best farmland is located as well. So this is the percent of Canada's, of each province, percent of Canada's total prime land. So Saskatchewan has 38.6% of all of the prime land in Canada. So we can see again here, just as the map showed, it's not equally distributed. So we have 60% within 2 provinces and 87% within 4 provinces. And then from Quebec down to Newfoundland, it's pretty sparse when it comes to prime agricultural land, with BC having only 1.4% of prime agricultural land. So again, from a policy perspective, the abundance or the prevalence of certainly prime land, but agricultural land generally has an influence on the level of interest a province might have on protecting its agricultural land base. And it does play out differently right across the country. But we can couple that sense of with where the land is located and how much there is and where the best land is located with the loss of farmland. And this is an interesting, next 2 pictures. This is Eastern Canada. And this is from 1961 to 76. So it's a really interesting period of time. Certainly the 50s where urban sprawl really started, but 60s and 70s being a dominant period. So this map, the peachy color shows increases, and then the darker grays show loss of farmland. And you can certainly see that the Eastern Canada was dominated by a loss of farmland, and especially around certainly the Toronto area, the southern part, not the southwestern part of Ontario, but certainly some key parts of Ontario, especially around Toronto, where the darker shades of gray are. So again, this is 61 to 76. And I'll point out here, since the reference is there, this is it's from a 1982 document by McQuaig and Manning. And McQuaig and Manning worked on developing really the Canada Land Inventory. Part of that project, and these maps, 2 maps I'm going to show you, are part of the whole process that started in around early 60s to develop the CLI. But here's Western Canada, and quite a different picture. Rather than being dominated by gray, we can see that the Western Canada between 61 and 76 expanded its agricultural land base. So that's very different from Eastern Canada. But what we do see here, though, is a similar trend where the metropolitan areas are the areas that these polygons that include urban centers are the ones that are losing agricultural land. So that's consistent between Eastern and Western Canada. So it's a nice, interesting historical perspective. Here's another one produced by Stats Canada showing the expansion of urban areas in the lower mainland. So the darker pink is more recent, and the time period here is from 71 to 2011. And again, here we can see that certainly in the 50s and 60s, much of the lightest pink would have been also certainly the outcomes of rapid urban development. But here is images of the loss of farmland. And it's again, from a policy perspective, this is what a lot of it is driving the interest in protecting agricultural land right across Canada. But when we combine the loss of farmland with prime agricultural land, there's some pretty startling and concerning stats to come. And these are from Statistics Canada. 2005, 2013, 2014, and 16 are some really important studies, assessments of the state of agricultural land in Canada. So from those references, by 2001, about 1/2 of Canada's urbanized land was located on prime agricultural land. So we're already talking about a limited amount of prime agricultural land in specific areas, but those specific areas certainly be Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver being the dominant ones. But those areas then being built on prime agricultural land. But again, the stat being about 1/2 of urbanized areas on prime land is significant. So 2000 to 2011, the settled area on prime agricultural land actually increased by 19%. So it certainly during that period, it wasn't abated. Consumption of prime land by urban areas continued. And then through the same period, the flip side of that is the farm area located on prime agricultural land actually declined by almost 1 million hectares. So that's a significant drop on the farm side. So these are only 3 of the statistics, and these references really do an excellent job of documenting the state of farmland and the loss of farmland and this interaction between certainly prime land and urban areas. Again, from a policy perspective, these are really startling statistics. It really shows the challenge and the ongoing threat, and not sort of while we started the documentation of loss of farmland in the late 50s, here we are in this 2015 documenting the continual loss of farmland. But when I say the loss of farmland, I do want to add a nuanced piece. So there are different factors. The absolute conversion of farmland to non-farm uses, so replacing farmland with urban areas, is the conversion of farmland. But there's other aspects, and that's, I guess, the easiest piece to measure. But there's other aspects of farmland loss that are much more difficult to measure and generally don't show up in the statistics. So we can measure the absolute conversion, the loss of farmland to conversion, far more difficult to go beyond that. So the general term alienation refers to non-farm development. So putting monster homes, vehicle storage, infill, those kinds of things on agricultural land, or the fragmentation of the land base. So dividing up parcels where there's non-farm developments or converted lands among farm parcels. And parcelization refers to scattered ownership, where farmers might be having to go further and further in order to access farmland, but the ownership base contributes to another form of fragmentation or parcelization. So these are forms of alienation that impact agricultural lands that, again, it's not just the absolute loss, but also the alienation being that it's still farmland. Technically, it's still zoned agricultural land, but perhaps its use as farmland has at least been compromised, if not been eliminated. And another concept that's been around for a few decades is this idea of urban shadow, and also referred to as the impermanence syndrome. And its general idea is that if a farmer and farmland is located close to an urban area that has a history of expanding, then this idea, the impermanence syndrome, refers to the farmer thinking that their presence on the land and the presence of agriculture in this area is not permanent. So there's a reduced investment in the agricultural land itself, in the farm operation. So this is the effect of an urban shadow. Again, on a map, it may not be converted, but it certainly is contributing to a loss of farmland. So these are additional factors, and here we have some pictures courtesy of the Agricultural Land Commission that speak to some of these the non-conversion impacts on agricultural land. So this is a beautiful pool with a nice agricultural area in the background. Here's some non-farm use of agricultural land to store vehicles. Large development, I'm not sure what it is, but certainly surrounded by agricultural uses. And this is a large building. I'm not sure if it's a house or not. But again, we can just see the use of what still would be zoned as agricultural land. Thankfully, this would not be permitted under the current legislation, but certainly was a permitted use as a household, if it is a household within an agricultural area. But there's also infill. So this is, again, courtesy of ALC, some pictures they have taken of certainly the use of farmland, inappropriate uses of farmland. Here's another example of fill. Here's pictures of extraction, and here's an overhead of extraction. And finally, just a picture of commercial activity. So just to give you a sense, again, there's whether or not these show up in these statistics around loss of farmland, chances are not, but it is inherent to the challenge of protecting farmland and show up that way. So with that quick introduction, really the summary is that our reality is, from a policy perspective, is that in spite of efforts to protect farmland for 40 years, we are still losing our agricultural land. But from a policy perspective, we do go back quite a ways. The Lower Mainland talked about uncontrolled residential development. So it's a grave threat to our most productive land. Said it's an utter folly to sacrifice our most fertile land. And then put forward just principles in terms of guiding residential growth away from low-lying areas, limiting the size of future cities. And then 10 years later, Land for Farming spoke about, as far as we can be seen, farmland in this region will continue to give ground under the onslaught of urban development. And without general acceptance for agriculture, it will be bleak indeed. So with that quick history, 10 years later, we get to the Agricultural Land Reserve itself. So established in 73, certainly progressive, very progressive at its time. And here we have just a map showing that 5% of BC's land base is agricultural land reserve, and 1.1% is then as prime. So that does set the context for how much agricultural land does Canada have and what is best farmland, but then it sets the context for how then is good legislation. So here is my attempt to answer that question in terms of what I came up with were 4 principles of public policy. So these I used as criteria. So if I wanted to know how good the policy was, I would ask these 4 questions. One, just in short form, is maximize stability. So if I looked at a policy, I would ask, and this is whether it's provincial or a local government policy, to what extent does this policy seek to maximize stability? And here it's the stability of a commitment, an expressed commitment to protect farmland. I'm going by examples. I'm going to show you how these are operationalized and what they mean by both a provincial and a local government level. But maximizing stability is having a commitment and then looking at how strong that commitment is. Second one is integrating priorities across jurisdictions. So recognizing that it's one thing for a province to have a strong or weak, but a strong provincial legislation to protect farmland. But does that provincial legislation require local governments to be consistent? Or to what extent does the province actually have control over what local governments do? Third policy is minimize uncertainty. And anyone who's looked at policy knows that there's lots of loopholes, ambiguous language. So the idea of minimizing uncertainty is to remove some of those qualifiers, some of the loopholes. So because we do know that if you can have a strong commitment, but if there are weak elements within a legislative framework, that's where the non-farm development is going to work its way into the system, is through those weaker elements. So once you take care of those first 3, then it's possible then to accommodate flexibility. And I emphasize this because a lot of policy changes, if you can look at the press releases, media releases, and BC is a great example, it's often done in the name of accommodating flexibility. So a few years ago, when the Agricultural Land Reserve was divided into 2 zones, Zone 2 criteria was introduced in the name of accommodating flexibility for more non-farm uses to support farmers. And then when it came back to 1 zone, some of those changes were also basically substantiated under the name of flexibility. But flexibility is important to accommodate, but only after one takes care of the first 3. So these are the 4 principles as I've developed, articulated, use them as criteria, but let me switch gears and just speak to then what my data set is. And as I go back to the beginning, I'm not looking at the outcomes of a policy, but looking at the policy itself, asking how strong it is and how, as it is written, how strong it is. So this is a typical data set for me. This is British Columbia's provincial legislative framework. And here in the center are the ones you're probably most familiar with. So here's legislation that refers to the Agricultural Land Commission Act, Local Government Act, Land Title Act, Farm Practices Protection Act, as well as regulations and others. But this is really at the core of a legislative framework. Here is where the provincial interest in protecting farmland is established, or to what extent it's established. So legislation at the core, and this is BC's example. In BC, there actually is an Agricultural Land Commission. Quebec is the other province that has a commission, and it varies, certainly not as, no other province has a commission that's dedicated to governing agricultural land, but there's certainly other governance mechanisms in other provinces. And policy needs to be distinguished from legislation. So there's certainly lots of policies. Unfortunately, many of it might be aspirational in terms of it has no legal effect or it can't be well enforced, but it might provide guidelines and direction to local governments or landowners. So recognizing that policy is critically important, but a different category from legislation. And through my work, one thing that really, it was a kind of a latecomer to the work I was doing. So I thought about integrating across jurisdiction, but this question about what is the level of requirement that a province actually, or what is the requirement that a province has in terms of to what extent must the local government be consistent? But there's another aspect to that as well in terms of to what extent does a province have direct control over statutory plans like an official community plan in British Columbia. So for example, here's just some statements that are from within the BC provincial legislative framework. So regional growth strategies must include a regional context statement. So this is referring to not to the province. Well, the province requires regional growth strategies to be consistent with its members' municipalities. So a regional growth strategy must include a regional context statement, or OCPs must be. And the OCP itself then, under Local Government Act, LGA, consultation during the development of an OCP, the local government must consult with the Agricultural Land Commission. So this is another, just to illustrate what I mean by required integration. So the first one was this integration between regional governments and its member municipalities. This one is the one that says that local governments must consult with the Agricultural Land Commission. And while this is here, I'll just point out that most provinces go beyond must consult. So to me, this is actually, it might seem like a minor example, but in a national context, comparing it province to province, it's much weaker than most other provinces. So I think Alberta is the other one, where most other provinces actually approve local government statutory plans. So BC is one that doesn't have that direct control. So even as you can see here, the language is must consult with. So these are really the types of terms that I'm looking for, the statements within legislative frameworks that help me to understand how these four principles have been operationalized. So let me take you through a trip across the country. And you can't see all the details here, looking at small text. I'm going to highlight a few things. But we have across the top here in the columns, the different provinces. And I won't go into it, but I've divided Ontario into two different regions, basically because of its legislative framework. But the first part is just right within each province then, to what extent do they express an interest in protecting farmland? So is it in clear, direct language? And most of them certainly have a commitment to protect farmland. So if we have in Quebec, it's secure a lasting territorial basis. BC's to preserve ag land, and some others like Ontario is to protect prime agricultural land, for example. So there's some differences, but almost every province has a statement, an expressed interest to protect farmland. And for most of those, they appear in literally what are called SPIs, or statements of provincial interest, or the somewhat equivalent is a PLUP in terms of a provincial land use policy. So there are documents that state provincial interests. BC doesn't have either a SPI or a PLUP. Instead, it does have the ALC Act, which functions as its provincial statement of interest in protecting farmland. So this just so far just shows that most provinces have some form of statement to protect farmland, and also that it's embedded in its legislative framework through different policy tools. But what really stands out in Canada is Quebec and BC, the only two provinces that have a dedicated agricultural land reserve and a commission then to actually oversee and to govern that agricultural land base. This is what I mentioned a few minutes ago, is that province to province, the requirements for integration, so the level of control that a province has over local governments in terms of the land use plans that they develop, mostly consistent across Canada, where provinces have direct control, but BC and Alberta stand out as having a more decentralized approach. And again, to me, that's one of the weaker elements of the BC's provincial legislative framework. So with that, it brings me to, well, here's one of those outcomes that my work contributes to the discussion. So farmland protection from a policy perspective asks the question, how good is the provincial legislative framework to protect farmland? This is the ranking or rankings that I get looking at all the provinces. That material I just showed you, that table, when I apply my criteria, and it's about doing contents analysis and then applying some arithmetic equations to, for example, stability is the most important one, and accommodating flexibility, as I said, it really depends on how well they take the other three. So there's some interactive elements of the policies that are embedded in some mathematics that are done in the background. But I do look at those, the content analysis is the driver, and Quebec shows up as the only province with a strong provincial legislative framework. So British Columbia and then the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt is the large area that goes from the Niagara region and surrounds Toronto. So the Golden Horseshoe, or the Greater Golden Horseshoe, is that Greenbelt policy. So that BC and the Greenbelt area of Ontario have somewhat strong legislative frameworks, but you can see there's many provinces that have weak. Prince Edward Island is one that was under development, and so once it's fully implemented, they will improve their ranking. So with that, we can compare the outcome. The results then show that if we look at the quality of the provincial legislative framework in combination with how much prime land, that's how I come to that one headline. In terms of only 7.6% of the best farmland in Canada is at least somewhat strong. And the headline I showed you earlier, the statement conclusion I said is protected by good provincial legislative framework. So more accurately, I can say that it's at least somewhat strong. But immediately, if you look at the number 7.6, again, of the best farmland, and we can see that most of the best farmland is not well protected by provincial legislative framework, which is concerning if one is certainly interested in protecting agricultural land and sees it as a scarce resource. So that sets national context. Can look also, do the same thing at local governments. And here, not for Jason's benefit, but Jason gets the benefit of me looking specifically at the regional district of Bulkley and Chaco. So looking at the work that he's responsible for. The outcome is good, Jason, so hang in here. But without going into a lot of the details, just want to acknowledge that, again, my data set is the legislative framework. So what policies are in place? And typically then the legislation includes official community plans. And I didn't verify, but I think there's 7 OCPs that are covered within the regional district. And then the zoning bylaw, and also at the provincial level through the LRMP, SRMP process, sustainable resource management plans, there are designated agricultural development areas as well. But what the regional district has actually a number of really important policies that are consistent with the land use policies in the legislation, and I've listed some of those here. Most recently, the new ag plan, but it has agricultural land use inventories, the ALUIs. But if you look at the housing in RDBN policy, as well as the, well, stop there anyways, the housing policy discussion paper also speaks to the need to manage or recognize the need to protect agricultural land. So all of this becomes raw material. So here's some examples then. So in terms of maximizing stability, we're typically looking for that clear, direct language. So within, this is electoral area A, official community plan for area A, but the same language is across all of the official community plans. So they're pretty much all the same, which is great. Again, another strong sign of stability, maximizing stability. Again, this is the language that I look at. And to me, this is a good example of clear, direct language to protect farmland. So this is what's also important is where within the OCP is this interest in expressing farmland stated. So right from the outset within our official community plans within the regional district, we see in the general plan vision references to agricultural land. There's a specific section that includes a vision for agriculture. And as we work our way through the official community plan, general plan goals number 6 strives to protect and preserve farmland and soil. Go further into the document, we get to the agricultural designations, the lands designated as agriculture, and the objectives is to protect and preserve farmland and soil. So all of these are just excellent examples of clear, direct language. So again, kudos to the regional district for having maximizing stability of its commitment to protecting farmland. So clear statements that are in the most important parts of a legislative framework. Integrating across jurisdictions. So here, from a local government, we're looking at to what extent does a local government refer to that provincial legislative framework. So level of detail, frequency of references. And again, the regional district does a really good job of this, refers to the Agricultural Land Commission, refers to the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission to protect farmland. So these are really good, again, a good example of integrating across jurisdictions. Typically, urban areas will have urban growth boundaries, and that's a really important tool to minimize uncertainty. It's not so critical in rural areas like a regional district, but it's still really important to recognize that we have to maintain or minimize the threat to agricultural land. So the threat of or urban development and settlement areas on agricultural land. So again, here's some examples where within the official community plans, they refer to the vision for quality of life. We're recognizing that we want to maintain the rural character. So we need to manage urban growth in order to basically protect that character. And it appears in different places within the legislative framework of regional district. And finally, I'll just note here, accommodate flexibility. Here's a couple of examples where the official community plan refers to home site severances may be provided. And on the point 7, there's a list of conditions or circumstances under which non-farm use will be considered. So both of these are examples of how one recognizes that there may be times when we want to consider or may want to consider non-farm development, but we are going to manage that and mitigate the impacts whenever possible. So with all that, here is the overall score then for the Regional District of Bulkley and Chaco. So overall, it actually gets a strong rating. I just did this for the last couple of days. I was kind of revisiting the first assessment I did in 2013. I would say, if anything, this might be on the slightly generous side, but I think an argument can be made for these numbers. And there's some room, more room for debate and discussion, but I'm comfortable with these numbers. So really maximize stability is good, excellent, or very good job of integration and minimizing uncertainty. So congratulations to the regional district. Jason, you and your team really do a good job of agricultural land use planning to protect farmland. Here we can see that if we look at regional districts across the province, not everyone does as well. So Metro Vancouver does quite well, but this is where the inconsistencies really start to show up. And just the different shades of green you're looking at here in terms of the darker green is stronger policies. So it's a good portion of the province that's under good and very good, a very strong protection, but there are some areas that are not. And this is, well, again, building a layer here. So provincially, we have somewhat strong in a national context. At the regional district, we see certainly some diversity of strengths at that level of government. And here's an example of municipalities that I've looked at. So within the Lower Mainland, which is 2 regional districts here, Fraser Valley, as well as the Metro Vancouver, we can see that among municipalities then that the level of protection varies. So one of the strongest across Canada, where you see the dark green here within Delta and Richmond, for example, you start to layer that with a very strong regional district within a somewhat strong provincial legislative framework. And within a Canadian context, that package across jurisdictions is easily one of the strongest and best in Canada. So it does stand out. So as British Columbians, we can be proud of what they've accomplished in that area. At the same time, being concerned that even in the Lower Mainland, where we have some really good agricultural potential and land, we still have a very significant diversity and inconsistency of quality of farmland protection. This table here just shows how, again, without going into details, it's more of from an image, you can just see the different range, where the different shading of green occurs. And mostly you can just see that there is a wide range of shading. Ideally, this should be all darker greens. So it's the lighter greens that really stand out as concerns, and the darker greens where it can be plotted. But again, just we've seen it, I showed it in the map images, but here in this table, you can see where the inconsistencies and the weak elements of our provincial legislative frameworks appear. And I just want to back up and just say, in the context of what I presented, we've been doing this for 40 years, I guess, being concerned about the loss of farmland. I can go back to 1917 when the first documentation about concerns for loss of farmland appeared in print. But we saw the Lower Mainland Planning Management Board expressing concern in 52 and 62 about the threats to farmland. And here still, let's say 40 years later, we're still looking at very problematic issues when it comes to protecting farmland. So that really comes to mostly what I want to show you in terms of what does farmland look like, farmland protection look like from a policy perspective. We've spent a lot of time looking at, again, we being academic or researchers, looking at the loss of farmland, far less amount of time looking at the quality of the policy itself in terms of how well are we doing in terms of writing policy that's going to protect farmland. So through what I've shown you, certainly this slide illustrates, again, the fact that there are some significant inconsistencies in some areas that we definitely need to address. But I've also showed you just the possibility of actually measuring the quality of a legislative framework to protect farmland. So that has been certainly one of my unique contributions to the literature. But it really also reflects just the inherent challenge of protecting farmland in BC, but right across Canada, North America. And I'd like to sum it up, and capture the challenge by referring to this international bestseller. Some of you may know about this book called Getting to Yes, Negotiating an Agreement Without Giving In. So it's a famous book about negotiating strategies, getting to yes. Well, to me, in the world of farmland protection, all of these policies endeavors are against this ongoing threat. And ultimately, the challenge of writing policies is getting to know, protecting farmland without giving in. So I just little play on words here, but to me, it really, among agricultural land use planning professionals, it's really driven by this struggle, a challenge to get to know. If it was, the ideal legislative framework, one that would get dark greens right across the scoring tables, would be a full moratorium on protecting farmland. But as soon as one opens up the possibilities, then yeah, it's really a struggle of getting to know. So as my final slide, I just want to as I said at the beginning, I encouraged you to think about how these 4 policies, what I was going to talk about, but the 4 policies, 4 principles, how might they apply to other worlds of policy? And just today, literally an hour before this lecture presentation started, I was reading this article and it just resonated with me. My interest is to apply this in the water governance world. So this being this method of measuring the quality, the strength of policy to protect a desired outcome. So water governance being one of those really important outcomes, as well as protecting farmland. But the subtext here, it just applies to farmland as it does to water. So not only is it a myth that Canada has an abundance of readily accessible water and agricultural land, say researchers, but we're poorly managing what we do have. So this, as I just read this a couple of hours ago, applies to water equally as well as to farmland. And to me, it raises an interesting question in terms of, I wonder if my approach to evaluating the quality of policy to protect farmland, I'm wondering whether and how well it might apply to water governance as well. So that's a next step. And I'm curious as to if any of you see opportunities or parallels or applications in the worlds that you work in. So with that, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you for listening, and we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, David.